No, I did sing. There were carols, socially distanced carols in New Palace Yard last week, and I boomed away. But fortunately, there were no nearby recording devices.
Protests, complaints?
Oh, no doubt. Yes, they'll be flooding in.
Well, now, talking of difficult subjects, the Brexit talks. Is it possible that a treaty could be agreed on December the 31st, enacted, and Parliament could approve it retrospectively? Or disapprove it, as the case may be?
The issue with the ratification of treaties is that it's what the two sides agree the ratification process should be. Now, normally you would expect a treaty to be ratified before it comes in to force, but if both sides accept that ratification is done in a different way, that is theoretically possible, but you get into the issue of the domestic legal effects of an international treaty. And the UK, as you know, is a dualist system, so things that we agree at the international level don't have the force of law at the domestic level unless they are enacted. So if you propose that, you would have a gap in the domestic legal effect of the treaty. And what does that mean? Well, you could retrospectively correct it. You could, I suppose, theoretically ignore the law for a week, but that's pretty unconstitutional territory. And if anyone took it to court, I think you'd find yourself in considerable difficulties.
So there may be a time factor here. You might arguably be able to avoid the consequences for a day. You almost certainly couldn't avoid the consequences for 3 months. So if it's going to be done at all in that way, the ratification would have to come very quickly in January.
Parliament will not be an obstacle to ratification, but I haven't heard anybody talk about ratification post the 31st of December. Now, bear in mind that Parliament was managed to pass the legislation to remove a King Emperor within 24 hours. So Parliament can act very quickly when necessary. But post the 31st of December ratification certainly raises legal questions that probably you're better off discussing with a lawyer rather than with me, but 3 months is inconceivable.
Let's assume that ratification happens before the 31st of December. In which case we then get round to asking how much time have we really got left?
That's a good point, and it's a point for both sides. As I said, you can really, really truncate the parliamentary process if necessary and if there's a will to do it. If there were an agreement today, I think you would need 6 days, in that you would have the text tomorrow, you'd have 48 hours to write the bill, and you'd have a day in the Commons, a day in the Lords, and a day for royal assent. But that can be squeezed. 6 days is tight, but 6 days at the moment is what I would expect the process to take.
And this would all be condensing a treaty of how many pages?
Well, what it is about is giving a domestic legal effect to a treaty, and the domestic legal effect may not be all-encompassing. It depends what the treaty covers.
Very big treaty, probably. Very little time.
That's true.
In short. So you said, were it to be reached today, agreement to be reached today, arguably the whole business could be done in 6 days.
That would get us through well, assuming we don't sit on Sunday, that would get us through to next Monday.
So if one was really looking at the last available date, which is the 31st, you'd subtract 6 days from that on paper.
Well, no, because I think you can truncate this process. I'm allowing 3 days for Lords, Commons and Royal Assent. That can, as I say, with removing a King Emperor, was brought down to 24 hours. So you can do that. Then most of the bill has probably been written because most of the text has been agreed. So there is the possibility of drawing up the bill as the negotiations progress, and therefore the 48 hours that you would have needed at the end of November comes down because more and more of it is done as you go along. So the 6 days can be squeezed. So I don't want to say Christmas Day is the last day. There is no last moment until Big Ben strikes
On the 31st.
11 o'clock, which it won't strike, will it? Because it will strike midnight, but not necessarily 11 o'clock. So I have misspoken.
I'm not going to ask you about the ratification process on the EU side, which is another matter altogether. Nor am I going to ask a lot of questions about the negotiations, because what's happening is necessarily obscure and no one's seen any texts. But is it your understanding that the basic cause of the impasse, if there is still an impasse, is that the two sides have not been able to agree about the policing of the level playing field?
And the potential for a ratchet.
Yeah.
I think that's the issue.
In fact, not so much regression, in other words, agreement about where we are now, but agreement about what would happen in future if either side changed their social provision.
You and I both understand it from what is reported, that, as you rightly say, the negotiations are going on confidentially, and rightly so. So the reports are that that is the key issue, yes.
Are you expecting a deal?
I don't know. The difficulties are significant. The issue of sovereignty is fundamental. We have to be in charge of our own affairs from 11 o'clock at night on the 31st of December. We can't continue to be a vassal of the European Union. This was the reason Boris Johnson got elected a year ago. It was the vote we had in 2016. We've got to respect all of that, but not only respect it, we really believe in it. This is hugely to the advantage of the country. And this, to some extent, gets missed in the minutiae, in the details, in is it a bit of fish or whatever it is. What we were always campaigning for is the real interest of the United Kingdom to be a free country. Why? Because we'll make better decisions, we will be better governed, we will be more prosperous. And we don't want to do anything that shackles, hampers, or reduces that opportunity.
Do you feel that, I don't know, business, TUC, top echelons of the civil service, whatever, have expected a deal? I confess that on the whole, that's been my feeling, and rightly or wrongly, I have. Why? On the general ground that, well, there's always a deal in the end. It happens at the 11th hour, and well, there was one last time, wasn't there? So there'll be one this time.
I think your logic's absolutely impeccable. I think that's why most people have been expecting a deal. I think they have underestimated the determination and the clear-sightedness of the Prime Minister. I think they've thought that this was a business-as-usual government, that once again it would give in to the EU, and they suddenly realised that actually the Prime Minister got elected on a mandate not to give in to the EU. He'd campaigned for us to leave, and he is absolutely set on protecting our sovereignty in any deal that he does. So a normal free trade deal, sort of deal you do with other countries, that's great, and if we get that, it's all tickety-boo. On the other hand, there are enormous opportunities for us with the rest of the world, and having our sovereignty and not being shackled is more important than whether or not we do a deal with the EU.
It's been a year pretty much since the general election, and a kind of extraordinary year with the coronavirus and all that. What, as Leader of the House, at the end of that year, are your reflections on the nature of this particular Parliament?
Well, it's been a very strange Parliament because it's been absent from its normal, vibrant activity, hasn't it? That the Chamber has been limited to 50 members, members have been zooming in, the Deputy Chief Whip has a vast number of proxies. So the activity, the hubbub that Parliament normally is, has been absent. But we have nonetheless got a good deal of business through, and we've got the Withdrawal Act through very early on, and obviously the COVID regulations have been passed effectively. there's been also the preparation for the next year. There's a good pipeline of legislation from the general election victory, from the manifesto. And what I think this year has been about, in spite of the difficulties of COVID, is the building of a platform for the delivery of all that was promised in the manifesto, to make sure that we're ready, that, to use Bill Cash's phrase, we've got our ducks in a row, and that therefore we will be able to deliver on the promises that we gave to voters a year ago, and those are all very much at the forefront of members' thinking on the Conservative benches.
You don't feel at all, I mean, we've had this discussion before, so I'm just going to give it a brief run around again to see how it goes. You don't feel it's become more difficult to get stuff through, even with a majority of 80, given some of the changes that have taken place in the nature of Parliament and arguably in the disposition of MPs?
There's a very interesting examination of that, isn't there? That rebellions in Parliament have grown since the low point in the 1950s, I think, and that MPs have realised that they have the ability to make their own minds up, and that actually is a thoroughly good thing. We are a representative democracy, and people should stand up for what they believe. We've also had, particularly around COVID, Conservative MPs making an argument that nobody else is making, which has been very important, that you needed the argument for freedom to be made. The Prime Minister is, I think, the most freedom-loving Prime Minister this country has had, arguably since Asquith. And therefore, that the argument was being made in Parliament was, I think, actually helpful to the government. So, yes, MPs argue their point, as they should, as it's right that they should, but I think they also recognise that they were elected on a Conservative manifesto with a Conservative mandate. And if you look at the majorities the government got on the Lord's amendments to the UKIM bill, the United Kingdom Internal Market Bill, last week, they were up towards 100. They weren't quite 100, which shows a pretty high degree of unity on, of all things, the European subject, and a pretty contentious European subject at that.
I want to close with just a couple of questions about the coronavirus. I mean, there will be a relaxation of the rules over the Christmas period. Is it essentially the case that because the government felt you couldn't really police what people did at Christmas, they would do more or less whatever they wanted to do, therefore the whole...
We will make America great again.